Tom Barr is a very special person because he is who I want to be when I grow up. His plant hobbies, he's about 10 years ahead of me in all the plant hobbies that I'm interested in. So he's a horticultural professor. He's an international speaker. He's probably best known in the planted aquarium hobby. He's got his own website forum thing where he's been giving people advice for a very long time. He's also growing bonsai at home and at the school, and propagating and raising funds for the school he teaches at through the students and their propagation learning. And so he is going to talk to us about fertilizing carnivorous plants today. So let me get his presentation up. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to force mute everybody, and just the co-host will be able to unmute themselves. So if you have a question, there are nonverbal cues down at the bottom of the participants list. One of them is a blue hand that indicates you're raising your hand. So if you have a question that you want to verbally ask, use that blue hand button. I will put it up so you can see what that looks like on one of my accounts. Just like that, so we'll recognize you and I'll unmute you, and then you can ask your question. Or preferably, if you can use the group chat, post your question there, and one of us will read it out loud and step in. So give me 1 second to mute everybody. And then let me find Tom Barr. I'm going to give you the unmute. So you should be able to unmute yourself, Tom.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I'm here.
Perfect. And I am going to.
Everybody hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good.
So I'm going to pull up your presentation now. There we go. The floor is yours, Tom.
Okay, let me try and get to the presentation part. Okay, everybody hear me?
Yep, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay, and you have the first slide up?
Correct.
Okay, I can't see the slides on Zoom, but I can see it on my computer. So I'll just go through, but I can see the pop-ups. If somebody has a question, just please ask. I think that's the best sort of format. Sometimes it slows the talks down, but it's good that everybody gets their questions in before they forget them. It's a harsh thing. I forgot what I was going to ask. So yeah, just go ahead and stop and just type in your question, whatever, or raise your hand, and we'll get to you that way. That's the easiest. I just want to preference. Kind of the whole thing about me was I didn't know anything about chemistry. I didn't know anything much about plants. I was a total beginner. I had no clue. There were very few resources when I got interested into plants. This is probably about 35 years ago, and before the internet. And the internet really helped me a lot back in the 90s. To sort of branch out and sort of see what was known, and to work with other people and sort of on common goals and passions. One of them was plant nutrition and fertilizers, and aquatic plants and carnivorous plants have they're very closely related, and sometimes they overlap, such as the bladderworts, and some of the others are pretty much. Most of them are bog plants. There are exceptions. Carnivorous plants are a very wide group, but they're mostly herbaceous, like most of our aquatics as well. And they grow pretty quick. They're not too bad. Let's go to the next slide. So how do you apply, sort of plant research, practical issues to carnivorous plants? As I was saying, general, most are sort of this wetland, peaty bog soil sediments, which is pretty much aquatic plant sediments. They're not like aerated soils at all. Most of the carnivorous plants tend to have pretty weak root structures, things like that. Here's a little Utricularia, heterophylla. It's sort of like the gramifolia that's commonly grown in aquariums, except the blade's about, maybe a centimeter long. And so it's a very tight grass-like plant. A lot of times you go to, I have a carnivorous plant, California carnivores up off of in Sebastopol. That's sort of my closest really good carnivorous plant nursery around here. I'm sure you've talked to those folks over the years or seen pictures of the place. It's definitely worth the trip. Real nice folks, have a really wide range. They have a YouTube thing. They have a lot of cool butterworts now, which I really like a lot. But I think a lot of the things that I've learned from aquatic plants really apply to a lot of other things, such as anything from bonsai to carnivorous plants to begonias to all these different sort of subgenres of the plant interest groups. The other question really is, what do these large production greenhouses do? And I have been working with Amazon, and I had sort of this notion like, you don't need to add any fertilizers. The bugs alone will provide the nutrients. And they're like, oh no, we're adding 400 parts per million of fertilizer to this stuff. And I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah. And I go and look, and these huge, beautiful examples. So I'm kind of like, well, the proof is in the pudding. I can't argue with that. So next slide. You guys in that Venezuelan picture? Okay.
Habitat for CPs, yes.
Yeah. And so this is, what I would consider Shangri-La of, carnivorous plant habitat, native, place, you'd love to go there, like, Borneo, at the highland species up there. But that is pretty much exactly what aquatic plants look like in their habitat too. Not as pretty. And there's probably some Utricularis floating around in there as well. Maybe Utricularis stellaris or something like that in the water. Very common in Florida. A lot of carnivorous plants there. There's actually quite a few in California. And most of them are actually up in the alpine areas, Utricularia vulgaris. You can find that in Yosemite National Park up in these alpine lakes. It's amazing where the places that you find these plants. So it's a very wide range of plants. But I always like to look at the natural systems and kind of think about those a little bit before, applying sort of horticulture. And it's just, to see the natural beauty and how the plant actually grows and in nature, and see if I can at least reproduce that, if not more. Next slide. Our good old Venus flytrap. My dad had, when I was little, we stayed in a place called Highlands, South Carolina. It's a pretty well-known area. Has a lot of CPs. And I guess I was about 3, and he took me and my mother and I went to this little waterfall. And he spent a long time trying to get a good photo of this plant hanging over a waterfall, and he about fell in himself a couple times. And I remember that as a kid, and I remember like, why is he doing this? And you know, it wasn't until decades later did I realize how kind of cool the place was and how special it was, and you know, how lucky I was to have been raised in that area for several summers. There's a research biological station there. But there was one, it was just like hanging right there over the waterfall, very wet. You could tell it, you know, but that place was pretty much a, you know, tropical rainforest in the summer, you know, a mountain, hardwood, hot, wet place. Very, very similar to a tropical rainforest. Next slide. And this is more closer to home for me. This is up north in Humboldt, Del Norte County, one of the two. I'm trying to remember which. But our good old friend, you know, the California Darlingtonia cobra plant. These are quite large. Some of the larger ones, there's a little bog sort of up the coast a bit, maybe at 500 feet elevation. And these guys are quite large, big, healthy population of them there. They have a nice walkway. If you ever drive up north, see the redwoods, definitely stop in and see these guys. Next slide. This is the same plant, but at 7,000, almost 8,000 feet. This is up by Deadfall Lake, base of Mount Eddy. And I think my wife and I, this is the first place we went on sort of like a camping trip, a date. And we had our tent right next to a whole thing of it. These guys are probably a quarter to an eighth the size. The growing season is brief up at this altitude, but it's doing quite well. This is sort of at the bank of a alpine lake, and it gets a lot of runoff from snow, and it's a very, very peaty bog coming down this hillside. One of my friends wanted to take some. I said, well, good luck with that. And they kept it for about 6 months in the terrarium. They eventually killed it, but I figured as much. But this particular group, this lake, it's very very pure water, very clean, and not a lot of nutrients in it either. Whereas the other place, yeah, it's a bog, very nitrogen limited, but it had a fair amount of nutrients compared to this. Next slide. A lot of people think, well, you know, carnivorous plants, oh, they're tropical, and yeah, there are some very pretty, interesting species in the tropics. But you know, this is up in you know, Canada, in Ontario, and there's some very nice examples up there. There's, you know, this whole research done on salamanders living in the traps and eating the bugs and insects that come in there to feed the fry, and a whole host of things there. But I just like to show a sort of diversity of habitat, not just one habitat. Tends to help think about plants and their adaptability. Next slide. Butterworts are kind of a more of a drier species. These are the Mexican ones, anyways. Those are the ones that tend to be quite popular, and they're very similar to Dudleya, and as far as their habitat, growing on rocks, kind of dry spots, that kind of thing. They're kind of a interesting. California carnivores, they have quite a few species, and they have several videos on it. It's kind of interesting. But this is very different than an aquatic system. And I keep Dudleya, native Dudleyas out here, out back in my yard, along with the bonsais. I haven't gotten into the butterworts quite as much, but I'm probably pretty close. So very interesting group. Next slide. Aldrovandra. This is our one of the very few flytrap species, besides the classic Venus flytrap. It's aquatic. This picture looks big. The plant's probably only about a centimeter wide. So those traps are maybe 3-4 millimeters, something in that, and maybe a little bigger, maybe 5 if you're lucky. As far as the length on them, they're pretty small, diminutive plants. Floaters. They're not hard to grow. They form turions when the temperature gets below around, I would say 65, 60 degrees. They'll form turions, and it's just a little vegetative bud. And when the temperature goes up, they start growing again. And they're pretty easy to grow for aquarists, and not too bad. I've never flowered it. I'm not sure what the flower looks like, but I've grown it quite a bit and sent quite a bit off to different folks who are interested in it. Next slide. Dewy pines, kind of a weird one, but it should do really well in California. Similar habitat, kind of dry, Mediterranean climate, Portugal, Spain, maybe Morocco, and some other locations, maybe parts of France even. But it's an interesting sort of oddball carnivorous plant as well. Next slide. Our pitcher plants, these are classic ones. This is one of the first carnivorous plants I got many years ago, and I kept it under a tree outside, under an orange tree actually. It had a lot of fruit flies, and it did quite well. Didn't like the cold, doesn't like the freezing up here. Didn't do too well because of that. Probably going to get a greenhouse before I get more of these. I have a plan for a 12 by 24 greenhouse here at the property I live at now. So eventually I'll get one and be able to keep these guys pretty easily. Next slide. So as I was saying, most of the habitats tend to be wetland. Some are entirely submerged, such as the tricularas, butterworts. Some are cloud forest. Growing seasons tend to be that May, October for the drier species. That's when most of the rains are in Mexico, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, the Western Ghats in India. I don't know if there's any species there, but there's a lot of aquatics, and that's when they get the rains as well. There are exceptions. You know, carnivorous plants are very wide-ranging groups, such as sundews. They're all over the place. I saw some in Australia, and just on bare rock and a little bit of sand. Very, very interesting places up in the Blue Mountains and up near Brisbane and some other locations. But yeah, it's pretty much a wetland habitat. And as an aquatic plant person, I'm pretty good with the soils and the sort of the nutrient cycling within a aquatic system. And that seems to have helped my understanding with fertilizing these plants as well. Next slide. So based on aquatic plants, how should we fertilize them? You know, how should we fertilize these plants? Generally, most common methods do not add any fertilizers. It's like heresy almost to some people. It's like, oh, we just allow the insects. Well, if you're doing large scale production, greenhouse, you're trying to limit it, aphids and other pests coming into your greenhouse, different things like that. You're not going to have a lot of control over your amount of nutrients coming into these things. A lot of times people maybe will put maybe one little Osmocote ball in some of the pitchers, and that's quite common. I've been doing that as well myself. But as you know, you get more and more interested in large scale production, plant production, propagation, then some of these fertilizing methods really come into play. So that's something to think about. The other thing to think about as far as aquatic plants, most of them can take up nutrients quite well from foliar applications, and they're just sitting in a bath of water. And for the carnivorous plants, you know, we can spray them with a light fertilizer, something like that. And I was thinking that, and I talked to the guys up at Amazon who do all the horticulture work for them. And they do, they love kind of weird plants. And so they have all these things at the spheres and some of their public and some of the corporate headquarters. They have in some of these buildings all these cool plant-based interior sort of systems, green walls, aquariums, and a huge thing for carnivorous plants, begonias, things like that. And I was suggesting maybe 50 parts per million of fertilizer, and Ben was like, "Oh no, man, we're doing like 400." And I'm like, "Really? I mean, I don't even do that for regular lettuces, things like that." I was like, "What's going on here?" So maybe I was being too conservative, but I don't know what he was exactly what he was growing, but he was larding on the fertilizer. So I was very surprised by that. Next slide. Ranges and methods. One thing I often talk to aquarists about, or even bonsai folks, is one method suitable for everyone, for all goals that you might have? And the answer is clearly not. There's going to be several methods. And well, which method is best for you? Well, it depends on your goal. And so if you have a particular goal, say it's propagation of just pitcher plants, you're going to have a different method than the gal trying to grow the butterworts or the Dewy pines, other things like that. And so a lot of times, you can talk to people, see what they did, look at their results. Did they get really good results? Did they get healthy plants? Were they able to propagate them well? In aquatic plants, I think a lot of people maintain a lot of the interest, and the hobby sort of pays for itself if you can grow it and then you can sell your plants. So propagation becomes a very big factor. But if you can propagate really well, you usually can grow really well, and you usually have real pretty plants, nice big displays, and nice fat pot full of your carnivorous plants. And it's the same way with aquatic plants. It's the same way with bonsai, begonias, whatever it is. Those sort of factors tend to be true. You can sell things better if you have a nice example also, rather than just sort of a rare plant. And it's just one sort of little dinky plant off to its side, and you got one little plantlet off of it, you're going to sell that, versus the guy who has big, huge, healthy stand of it. That's generally going to sell a lot better. Greenhouse, this is just what we do for veg crops and some other things. We might, on young plants, we'll usually use about 50 parts per million of fertilizer, and we usually just use a siphon, and the fertilizer, it sort of pulls out about a 1 to 17 ratio for the spray, and we'll spray it on. We usually use about 50 parts per million initially. And then as the plants start doing well, getting in better health, we might go up to 100 parts per million, usually maybe a month or two later. Some folks have done up to 400 parts per million. I haven't done that. I've gone to 2. That's about it for carnivorous plants. Well, I found that this sort of makes sense. Hobbyists have not been favoring such suggestions. And, but I've seen other people do it, and I'm like, well, if it's just the fertilizers that's going to cause the problems, how come they didn't have that problem? Maybe there's something else. There's these sort of other independent factors going on in the growth. Maybe I didn't have the right humidity. Maybe I should have put that plant on the the sunny side of the just the morning, get the morning sun. Maybe I should have put the plant, maybe insect got, maybe I didn't water it enough, or maybe the tray dried out too much. Maybe the pot was too high, not get enough capillary action for the moisture coming up to the root zone. There's all these different factors that could have happened. But I know, independent of those factors, if somebody's adding that much and the plants are doing really well, I know I can probably rule that factor out as a negative response if the plants are doing really well. If you're not very good at growing plants, well, you might be tempted to say, well, maybe too much fertilizer that caused problems for me. I would take it easy, and just, if you've got some extra plants, try it out. Try doing a little bit more, say 3 different levels of fertilizer, and see which one works best under your sort of care. And then from there you can sort of figure out which ones have a good response for you. It's not that hard to do if you have extra plants. If you have some rare new plant, no, I wouldn't do it. If you got a ton of pitcher plants or cobra plants, whatever it is, then you can give it a try. Next slide. So what's correct? I'm not entirely sure. A lot of people they look to me for this sort of authority and all that, but I'm full of questions. Not so many answers. I wish I had more answers, but I tend to look for kind of interesting questions. There's been a very anti-fertilizer group going way back in aquariums. They were thinking, just to add a teeny bit of fertilizer, and it's like, these things are aquatic weeds. They grow really fast. And so some people, they would use soil instead. But the soil was even richer than the fertilizer in the water column. And so now kind of people do rich soil and kind of light on the water column, just because some people think it's sexy. But plants grow quite well in both cases. The aquatics do. And some of them are tricularis, and they do quite well. I go back to, one method works for everybody. No. But, the more people that are trying different methods, the better. Because then you sort of focus in on which plant does best under what conditions. That's one of the main factors. With that, I just kind of want to lead into the fundamentals of fertilization and sort of nutrients. I'm going to probably go through some things quick and sort of hit on some points. Okay, next slide. First sort of person who did a lot of research on fertilizers was a guy named Liebig, Justice Liebig, the law of the minimum. Basically, it just says that the nutrient that's in the most least supply will limit plant growth. In aquatic systems, this is true for aquatics and probably very true for most of our carnivorous plants, is nitrogen. And bogs, wetlands are almost always nitrogen limited. And there's a few reasons for that, and I can talk about that. I have another slide coming up about that. Next slide. This one's a different sort of barrel idea with the planks. Liebig was very interested in this sort of visual concept, and it works quite well. I like this one because it just shows, plant growth rate, oxygen evolution, whatever it is, metric to measure, plant growth. You're going to get the maximum amount as long as those other factors are, higher up. You add more potassium, calcium, magnesium, chlorine, whatever, light. But this one also has some interesting things like carbon dioxide, soil conditions, other factors, maybe pH. Is it in there? Nope, pH is not in there. But you can put it under soil conditions and other growth factors. Temperature, light. Yeah, we got temperature and warmth in there also. Water, obviously, but we tend to water pretty well for carnivorous plants. And aquatic plants, I don't have to worry about watering. Those, cacti, those are two plants a lot of folks do well with because they don't have to water them. Okay, next one. Next slide. And so this one sort of looks at temperature. No, CO2 and light intensity. And we also have something like this with aquatic plants also. Higher light intensity, the higher your CO2 concentration. A lot of times we enrich things with CO2. I haven't seen too many studies that looked at CO2 enrichment with carnivorous plants other than Utricularia, and it definitely kicks Utricularia's gramifolia and I think it's it's not heterophylla, it's something else. Hetero starts with an S, the last part of it. Anyways, adding CO2 to that plant in an aquatic system definitely probably sends the growth rate probably 10 times higher at medium light intensity. So it definitely helps that. Be interesting to see if it works well with pitchers and some of the other species, butterworts, whatever, and other bog plants as well. Next diagram. This one incorporates temperature, CO2, and light. I think, yeah, it's got all three in there. And this is very true with aquatic plants. A lot of people are like, well, I can't grow mosses at high temperature. And it's like, well, they've been adding this same amount of CO2, and then suddenly you have this high temperature, and the growth rate's doubled. Between 20 Celsius and 35, it's at least doubled for a lot of aquatic plants, and they still keep adding the same amount of CO2. Well, you have to add more CO2 as that temperature goes up. And that's true with a lot of fertilizers too. If you're getting that higher growth rate, you're going to consume more nutrients as well. So that's something to ponder at those higher temperatures that we get in the summer here. I'm at 103 right now here, so very, it's the desert up here too. Just gets a little colder in the winter, a little more rain. Next slide. These are sort of what's called these sort of growth curves with fertilizers. You have this sort of not enough fertilizer, and you have this sort of deficiency symptoms, and then you get these sort of hidden hunger, where it's just fairly limited, but you're still getting decent growth. And then you get up to that critical range with sort of 90% maximum growth. And then you see that big wide range in the middle, sufficiency range. That's a pretty big target. And that's usually what most farmers, most horticulture folks sort of try and target with fertilizing. They want to get up to that point where adding just a little bit more fertilizer, you don't get any response from the plant. That's when you sort of target the maximum amount of growth with the minimum amount of fertilizer. And that's sort of a good target if you're growing 10,000 acres of corn. But it's also a good target for greenhouse production. You're not wasting fertilizer, things like that. It's not helping the plants either. Larger scales, fertilizers start costing a lot of money. Small scales doesn't cost very much money. So that's just something to ponder. But you have this sort of range, this big wide range, and that sufficiency range, or that so-called maximum growth range, is very large. And you get way out there and you start getting adding too much fertilizer, and you'll start getting sort of incipient toxicity, and then you finally get to the toxic range where you really start seeing a drop off in the growth rates, and then you finally kill something. Usually killing things happens a lot with ammonia. That's a big one. Ammonia actually works as a herbicide if you add enough of it. Good old rice plants, that's what they add up here. They pump the liquid ammonia right into the soil, to the wetland soil and to the clays here. And that's the only fertilizer they add to the wetlands up here. It's just ammonia. That is it. Next slide. How do we tell if the parts per million or rated fertilizer is deficient, excess, or just right? Well, there's test kits. What else? Next slide. I think most people, while some people are going to do a lot of testing, most people are just going to look at the plant. And if that works really well, if you've grown the plants for a few years, you have pretty good experience. But if you're new, then it's a little more hard to tell. In that case, I think for bonsai, carnivorous plants, including aquarists too, if you can get with somebody local that is doing well and see what they're doing, that tends to work quite well. But it requires a trained eye, and if you have somebody to help you, mentor you, and then it really makes the learning process much less painful. And it's good to learn through experience, as long as it's not your own. If you can do that, you can do soil testing also. And one way to do that is take like pantyhose or a fine mesh bag, and you can put the wetland soil and put it in that bag, and then just squeeze it and keep squeezing it and twisting it. And that'll squeeze what's called the pore water out. And you can test that pore water and get a pretty good parts per million with a lot of the liquid test kits out there. Lamont test kits, they're really good for soil testing as far as a hobbyist level kit. You should always use a known reference sample when sort of doing these hobby test kits too. We do it for research. You should definitely do it for the hobby test kits as well. The other way to do it is you can send your plant material off, say 2 different treatments, one with fertilizers, one with just bugs, say, and one with a lot of fertilizers, say just one with 50 parts per million, one with 200 parts per million, and one with just, say, insects and your normal mix. You can take a certain, I don't know, probably about maybe a couple 100 grams of plant material and of each, and just put them in a bag, brown paper bag, let them dry out, and then you can send them to the USDA lab, and they'll test it for you for a fee, and it's not that much, and they'll give you the nutrient breakdown of the plant material itself. And so you could see if those treatments of fertilizers are getting into the plant, and you can also compare the plant's length, the height, the general health and vigor, things like that. You can measure those, and you can compare those and get some more hard data when comparing fertilizing treatments and versus other different methods. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And this is just sort of basic fertilizer talk that I do for students. I just talk about macronutrients versus the micronutrients, commercial analysis, elemental analysis of the chemical fertilizers, fertilizer concentration calculations, parts per million, millimoles, meth equivalents per liter, fertilizer application. You do a pre-plant application. That's what they do with rice. They pump in the ammonia first into the soil, then they flood the water, 5-inch depth, and then they aerial seed the rice immediately after flooding. They do it really quick. One of the reasons why they do that, they don't want that ammonia breaking down into nitrate. And nitrate goes into the soil and takes off. Ammonia binds to the soil. And so they want that rice to get in there and get that ammonia right away. Top dressing, that's where you're kind of doing the foliar applications that I was talking about. And then liquid feeding. You can feed that, do fertigation, where it goes to the roots and to the foliar applications as well. Next slide. These are just sort of essential nutrients of plants, and it just talks about the ionic forms absorbed. With nitrogen, it's nitrate and ammonium. I think for most of our carnivorous plants, it's they're going to probably prefer that ammonia more, and that's true for aquatic plants. Add too much, you're going to burn your plants. So it's a more narrow range than a lot of the other nutrients. Some of the micronutrients you can get quite high, such as chloride. But overall, I think most of it is driven by that nitrogen. Next slide. And this is just sort of I drew this up pretty quick, and I have another one with wetland soils, sort of the cycling as well. And it's just to help people sort of think about this. One reason why there's so little nitrogen within an aquatic system, and most of your carnivorous plants are fairly aquatic in nature. They're emergent aquatics pretty much. Next slide. And this one is from I actually had this guy as a professor at the University of Florida, Reddy Ramesh. Really, this guy's the madman of wetland soils. He's by far the best person in the world on that topic. He's just full of a lot of really good information. But he went through the course and talked about each nutrient as far as cycling through a wetland. And if you could draw each one of these on an exam, he felt pretty good about you. And then if you could do some redox equations and some other nasty chemical and math stuff, then you got an A. If you didn't, well, maybe you had to take the course over. But you can see where some of the exports of the nitrogen comes out as into gas. You do get a little fixation from, say, Anabina, some other called diazeotrophic bacteria that can fix nitrogen gas and convert it to ammonium, and then that can come in. But there's very little of that actually in a lot of these aquatic systems, and you get a lot more of this nitrous oxide and into gas giving off. But you don't have that for phosphorus. You don't have that for potassium. You don't have all these sort of exports where it can gas off from the system. And so over time with plants, you get this real tight sort of recycling, and it's a pretty nitrogen limited system. And I talk about this in terms of aquatic plants and in terms of carnivorous plants in these systems, because this sort of gives you an evolutionary reason for why they need to go after the bugs for nitrogen. And it gives a pretty good rationale for, why these bogs are so low in nutrients, particularly nitrogen though. And so if you're going to fertilize, that's the area to look at, the nitrogen, perhaps one of the most focused ones. And it's true for corn and a lot of agriculture crops. Rice and corn are very heavy nitrogen users. But corn, it'll take up a lot more of that, takes up a lot more of the nitrate as well. Whereas most of your rice, they prefer the ammonium. So there's just a little bit of discussion. You guys can go back and look at that. I don't want to bore you to death with this stuff. There's no exam at the end. Don't worry. Anything like that. So go to the next slide. And so there's one down here about midway. There's a little hand-drawn example, and there's a rice plant next to it. And you're looking at nitrogen, and you see the older leaves. They're yellow in that little picture. And what the plant's doing, it's trying to stay up above the water and and trying to, keep producing new growth. And it's taking the nitrogen from the old leaves, and it's taking those amino acids and they're moving them up to the new leaves. And sometimes you'll see that with carnivorous plants. You see these black, sort of half dead pitchers, traps, things like that. And a lot of folks, I think, have rightly said, just leave it on and let them, transfer that up to the new leaves, the new forms, the summer leaves versus the winter leaves, things like that. And, it gets to a point, though, where, well, if I'm doing greenhouse production, I'm doing sales, I want things to look good. I'm going to go ahead and trim those off, too. But as far as, if you want to run things really lean, you're going to probably, just leave them on and let the plant do its own thing. Might not look as good, but maybe it's something you don't care so much about. You're all right with that, as long as the plant's healthy and it's doing the natural cycle. So those are just some ideas. Next slide. Phosphorus, talked quite a bit about that, different forms. There's different ways to get a lot of these fertilizers. You can get them from the raw salts, and you can also get them from organic sources as well. I do mostly organic fertilizers, especially for any of my veg crops. I do that here. Sometimes I'll go, I'll use just regular salts because the end result is still going to be the same. It's going to be that salt. But I don't do it a lot. I only do it for certain things. I do it for aquariums because I don't want all that organic stuff added to the aquarium as well. It'll muck up the water and cause algae from all the organics and lower the oxygen levels. Carnivorous plants, less of an issue. And the other cool thing about the organic fertilizers is they're slower release. And so over time, you're wasting less. And so that's kind of nice. With some of the terrestrial soils, things like that, there's a lot of mycorrhizae. With aquatic soils, you don't get much in the way of fungi in the soils. There are some, but they're kind of small, tend to be diminutive. They're not a huge factor like they are in the terrestrial soils, the wetland soils. Just not a lot of fungi. Next one. Next slide. And so talk a little bit about pH, influence of pH on different forms of phosphorus or nitrogen or particularly trace metals. I'll go to the next slide and you'll see a thing on the pH effects on different chelators for iron. In this case, it's iron. EDDHA, a type of chelator, that stuff is like blood red and it binds really hard to the iron, but it's available, very strong availability over a huge range, but it's pretty hard for the plant to pull it out of that chelator. DPTA is a very common one for hard water, moderate to hard water, and its percent chelation drops as you get up higher in the pH ranges. EDTA is the most common one, and it drops off down almost 0% after 8, and around 6 it's pretty good. Citrates, amino acids, gluconates, they're kind of low on the level as far as total percent chelation. And so what I do for aquatics anyways, for aquatic plants, is I'll use a mix of gluconate, which is very easy for the plant to get. Gluconate breaks down really easy into organic, just CO2 and water basically. Then I'll add usually EDTA, a little bit of that, and then a DPTA. DPTA might last, in my systems with soft water, it'll last 1 to 2 weeks. So it's harder for the plant to get, but it's available over a longer time. So that's, you can do different things with these chelators and things like that, but most of the chelators, they're only really apply mostly to the iron. That's the only thing we really need to chelate. The other metals, not so much. They're fine. Yeah, that low pH anyways, the peaty bog soil. You're down in the 3s to 5 range a lot of times, the peaty bog soils. Next slide. Potassium. This can be hit or miss if you're getting it in your tap water. If you're using all reverse osmosis water, adding a little bit of potassium might work for you. I'm not big on potassium chloride. I tend to use potassium sulfate more if I'm going to add it. The other thing you could do is, if you're adding potassium nitrate or monobasic potassium phosphates, they add quite a bit of potassium as well. So if you're adding the nitrate and the phosphate along with, you might not need it. So I generally don't add extra aquariums for it. I've never found I needed it. Next slide. Talk about calcium. Sometimes with CP folks, if they're not careful, they might use a sand mixed with peat. That's our basic sort of CP mix, different ratios of that. If you're ever using a sand or whatever, always test it with vinegar or hydrochloric acid, something like that, see if it foams. If you can clean it up, make sure it doesn't have too much calcium in it or any other salts. Be careful with that. I'll just say that. We got a couple yards in for the project we were doing, and it turned out it had lots of calcium and carbonates in it, which we didn't want for this pitcher plant. We're doing a nice garden of pitcher plants, sort of like a 20 by 5 foot wide section. So get it out of here. So be careful there. Next slide. Talk about sulfur. Get some of that rotten egg smell if you have too much organic matter in your soil. You gotta be careful a little bit with that. Sulfur reduction. Magnesium. That picture up there gives a pretty good indication of classic magnesium deficiency. And you get sort of that yellow veining in between your leaves. Good thing about magnesium deficiency, you can add a little bit to your plants and it'll come back real quick easily within a day. Should green up really well. And that's because magnesium is the central atom in the chlorophyll. And so if you don't have enough of it, plant's going to try and rob it and try and spread it out. You get a lot of the veining, especially in the older leaves. Next slide. Micronutrients. These guys are used in small amounts, and other than the chloride. Chloride, most folks' tap water has ample amount of that. Deficiency, toxicity sort of occur at these extreme pH ranges. As far as low pHs, that's usually what we have for carnivorous plants. I think aluminum is probably about the only one that really gets that toxic. The rest, pretty mobile, pretty easy to get. Not a lot of demand for them. Next slide. This talks a little bit about what sort of for iron and sort of some ideas that you can use to try different chelators. Next slide. Just talk about different chelators here and sort of the structure of them, what the plant does. It takes in, the chelator holds and has a certain amount of energy that it binds that iron by, and the weaker the binding, say like gluconate, easier it is for the plant to sort of pull it off and pull it into the apoplast or into the xylem, and pull up to the main shoot part of the plant and use for different things. Iron oxide, it's unavailable to plant. It's pretty acidic and soils that we have. So a lot of times the iron is in the right form already, but sometimes we still use, probably still use the chelators, especially for aquatic plants. We're down in very low pH ranges there too. Next slide. Talk a little bit about manganese, boron, zinc. Next slide. Molybdenum, copper, chlorine. I'm just talking about just sort of general things. You look through the slide. Hopefully, John will post the PowerPoint. If you guys want to look through the gory details, you can. Next slide. Fertilizer analysis. Just talk a little bit about this. NPK. Those are the numbers you see sort of on the bags. I talked the difference between elemental and commercial analysis, and I just got a basic sort of rundown there. Just keep that in mind. Next slide. I do a little conversion and for chemistry, and then give you an idea how much each of the elemental nutrients are in each bag of fertilizer. Next slide. And rates and concentrations, they vary. British system, a little different. Metric system. I prefer the metric system. We all should, but we're weird. I don't understand. In science, it's all the metric. We don't mess with that other stuff too much. But if you go to do your ag advisor applications and things like that, a lot of times they'll have it in the British system. So you still got to know both. Or you get somebody that doesn't have any clue on the metric system, but is very versed with the British system. So it's tough. Next slide. These are just some fertilizer concentrations, moles, that's molecular weight, millimole, micromole, things like that. Next slide. This just gives how to make 50 gallons of 200 parts per million of a nitrogen solution. Just talks about that. Go through the next slide. This slide just talks about sort of pre-plant applications. There should be ammonium on that top line as well. Then it talks about dry applications, fertilizers with good high solubility. Don't apply lime or phosphorus, they bind. Liquid feeding. There's a little hand-drawn chart there on the bottom. And this is exactly what we do, I think, for fertigation. Large commercial ornamental nurseries up here, we do about 3 to 5 billion a year in California on ornamental plants alone. Large nurseries like these guys, they do fertigation, and the good reason for that is they don't have any soil-borne pathogens. It's just sand and bark. And they spray the whole plant, and it sort of comes down into a collection pond, and then they recirculate it 3 or 4 times, and it eventually gets too funky, and they have to get rid of it after about 3 or 4 cycles of that. But what you get is you get a nutrient level up when you first dose, and then it drops down, and then boom, you do another nutrient dose, boom, and you get sort of this constant feeding versus intermittent feeding. And I think we all sort of do the intermittent feeding to a certain degree. We do that with bonsai. We do it with aquariums. You can put a dosing pump and it just drips just a teeny bit, every minute or so, something like that, and get really close to that constant feeding level. But for a lot of folks, that's just a little bit impractical. So that's something to think about if you're interested in doing fertilizing, things like that. Next slide. These are the things I usually use and have available. Potassium nitrate's probably my go-to for aquariums. Most of the ammonium I use in aquariums. It's all going to be locked into a clay soil, much like the rice example. And it lasts about 8-9 months to about maybe a year. And almost all that ammonium that's in that soil, that clay soil, is gone by then. At that point, I'm going to have to switch over, maybe add urea, or maybe more potassium nitrate, maybe a little bit of ammonium nitrate, something like that. There's also ammonium chloride. I don't like that as much as the first two, though, or urea. Urea is probably a better one. Talked about potassium sulfate a little bit. That's that monobasic potassium, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, traces, boric acid, iron. And then down there, I've got another classic thing, increase in growth, and then concentration of minerals in the dry matter in the tissue. You could also put concentration of fertilizers in your water, or in your aquarium water, or in your soil, something like that. You get up to that certain level, and you can see trying to, dose just enough to get A or B is pretty tough, even C. But that target range for D is really wide. It's really easy to hit that. And so for a lot of folks, if you can hit somewhere in between C and D, you're in pretty good shape. So you'll get that maximum yield with the minimum amount of fertilizers. Next slide. There are a lot of folks, when I got into this, there were no nutrient calculators. There was no internet. I think one of the first nutrient fertilizers calculators was a guy named Chuck Gadd back in, I think, 95, 96. Developed one, real simple one, spreadsheet. And now there's some real cool ones like the Rotala butterfly. You can use that as well. You can use your base salt. So if you don't know chemistry, you can still make stock solutions for phosphorus or for nitrogen, for ammonium, for nitrate, whatever it is. And they have a lot of brand names, mostly in aquarium materials. They also have a cool modeling function where you can add a certain amount of fertilizers, say once a week or twice a week, and flush out your system, and then do another fertilization routine as well. And it'll model exactly how much fertilizers are in your system. And you can also plug in things like, well, I assume that my plants are going to take up 5 parts per million of nitrogen per day, something like that. And so it's got a lot of flexibility as far as modeling. And so you can model how much fertilizers and sort of estimate. You can do a little test kit work as well, and then you can really target it in pretty evenly. So if you're into this stuff, it's cool. You can use it. If you're not into it, you just want to add a little bit here and there, you can still do that as well. I think a lot of folks generally just, they dose and just pray. Like, oh, please grow. I'm adding this stuff. I'm doing what I think is right. Might be, might not be. Depends on the plant. Some plants respond really well to certain conditions. Some are really respond very well to very low nutrient limited systems. And most of your carnivorous plants, they've been adapted to these real low nutrient systems. So there's going to be exceptions. I'm almost certain. There's almost always been exceptions with aquatics. You generally think, well, they're weeds, and most of them are. More ferts you add, the more plants you get. In a lot of cases. There are a few exceptions. I can think of about 15 to 20 species out of maybe 500, 600 that really thrive in that low nutrient environment, but they still have availability to the nutrients in the soil. There are others that float, things like that. They always do well if you add more ferts. They don't have any access to the root zone, so the only way they're going to get it is through the water. And so they usually do really well. I think that's it. Yes, that's it. And so I hope giving you guys some ideas, hopefully some tools to think about as far as trying different things with fertilizers and seeing if you get better results with this or not. I don't claim to know anything that sort of great about carnivorous plants. I've kept them for a while. I've kept utricularis for many years. But as far as most of your terrestrial type species, these guys, I've done well on them. Done pretty well. I had about a quarter of that. I've got three more of those, just like it. Outside, I have some pitchers that got a little burnt from the 105-degree temperatures we've had for the last couple weeks. Didn't spray them down good. Got what else I got? A lot of SARS. Got some Venuses. Got a lot of utricularis that are growing, but they end up getting sort of taken over by the moss in these terrestrial sort of growth. I grow them all outside. I'd like to get them in a greenhouse, and I would do much better with a lot of them. Hopefully I will soon, but that's another story. Okay, thank you.